This talk concerns some related ideas of separation and sort of non-self, but blending in sort of a different way around the questions of meaning and the questions of community. So I'll start here. Talk of demon drink and addiction as a slavery from within were central to Victorian addiction discourse. Clinicians in the 1950s then complained that their patients misconstrued addiction as an ego alien, a metaphoric monkey on their back. Such metaphors have remained part of our modern lexicon, with talk of hijacked brains, inner demons, and hungry ghosts. Yet, when Ugandan Pentecostals speak of the pain and suffering of addiction as being caused by a spirit, they are not speaking metaphorically. For them, addictions are not like spirit possession, or slavery for that matter, in the sense that one has metaphorically lost control of one's agency to another. To be addicted is literally to come under the control of a being that comes from outside the self. The same is true for Ugandan Basamize, who engage in forms of spirit mediumship and worship known in Uganda as kusamira. Yet for these Basamize, the task is not about deliverance, but is rather about finding ways to better engage with the spirits by recognizing prior obligations and moving into more productive relationships of reciprocity and mutual care. Yet, despite all of their differences, both groups see alcohol-related problems as resulting from the actions of external spiritual forces. Where they differ, and here they differ strongly, is in regard to the moral valence of these external spirits and what ought to be done about them. While both secular and religious scholars might quietly scoff at these sorts of accounts, in this talk, I want to explore the affordances of these ways of viewing and experiencing addiction and recovery for Ugandans attempting to leave problematic forms of alcohol use behind. While the idioms of bondage, dedication, and possession are at times severe, I want to argue that they contain within them concepts and practices that point away from a model of addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease and towards some possibility of release. The arguments and stories I'll be presenting this morning are drawn from a collaborative study of the techniques Ugandans living in the suburbs of Kampala use to respond to cases of problem drinking. How do I change the slide? There we go, great. While approximately 58% of Ugandans claim that they abstain from alcohol use entirely, the WHO estimates that those who do drink have exceptionally high estimated per caption consumption rate of 23.7 liters of pure alcohol per year. And for comparison, the estimated per capita consumption rate among American drinkers is 13.3 and Russian drinkers 22.3. I began this study with my colleague George Mpanga in 2015, and Sarah Namarembe joined us in 2018 following the receipt of funding from the National Science Foundation. We concluded our formal data collection process this past summer. Over the course of these 4 years, we've engaged in collaborative ethnographic fieldwork with Ugandans working to leave alcohol. Given the relatively recent introduction of Western ideas of alcoholism and addiction in Uganda, most of these people have used other therapeutic resources, including herbal emetic therapies, engagement with Lubale spirits through kusamira, forms of deliverance and spiritual warfare practiced in Pentecostal and charismatic churches. A major portion of our work has been an effort to follow 16 people who have attempted to stop drinking using one or more of these therapeutic pathways over the course of several years following that attempt. While these therapeutic pathways differ from one another in substantial ways, they all present challenges to the prevailing biomedical model of addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease and offer alternative models of understanding the self that can have profound consequences for the forms of life and sociality that can follow an attempt to stop drinking. By exploring the affordances of these alternate ways of describing and engaging with problem drinking, my colleagues and I hope to contribute to a reconceptualization of addiction and recovery that may prove relevant well beyond Uganda. Before moving forward with the stories I'd like to share from our work in Uganda, I want to pause and say a few words about the current conceptualization of addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease in the United States. While this model did not fully coalesce until the 1990s, it drew upon an earlier body of work carried out with primates and prisoners during the mid-20th century at the Monkey Colony at Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the Addiction Research Center, a basic science laboratory that was once part of a federal prison hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. Like the turn of the 10th century clinicians that came before, they saw addiction as a disease like the turn of the century clinicians who saw addiction as a disease and sought to cure it using a mind-bogglingly diverse array of techniques and corresponding theories of the physiological causes of addiction, the mid-century researchers sought to move addiction from the moral domain of the will into the medical domain of the body. That said, the mid-century research carried out at Ann Arbor and Lexington differed from the earlier turn of the century work in its unification under a national coordinating committee that focused on developing a cohesive model of addiction. These researchers also differed from their predecessors in their shift away from a focus on developing cures for addiction, and in their growing sense that addiction might, at least in some cases, be incurable. This sense of addiction or drug dependence as a chronic disease that was to be managed rather than an acute condition that could be cured, with relapse being an expected part of its course, solidified in the 1990s under the chronic relapsing brain disease model. While the idea that addiction and drug dependence could sometimes be an incurable or chronic disease was somehow present for mid-century researchers as well, this idea becomes central in the 1990s as talk of hijacked brains and fluorescent images of fMRI screens began to flash across American television screens. And this is a still from the hijacked brain aired in 1998. Interesting. What happened to the pictures? Well, we'll see if it comes back. Another vision of chronicity has also been circulating in the United States since the 1930s through the work of the mutual aid fellowship Alcoholics Anonymous. And if you could see the image here, it would be a poster advertising one of their meetings in Kampala. Those of you familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous might at first find our claims that spiritual experiences and addiction resonate with AA's long-held position that sobriety can only be achieved through spiritual awakening and engagement with God. Yet, despite Alcoholics Anonymous' famous caveat that conscious contact with God was with a God as we understood him, the vision of God in AA is actually quite specific and quite different from the role that spiritual forces play in many of the stories that have been shared with George and Sarah and I over the past 4 years. The higher power in AA, and the use of the singular is important here, is an always benevolent force whose primary role is to strengthen the will of the alcoholic who has become powerless over alcohol so that he can live a sober life, despite his unchangeable condition of being an alcoholic. While these images of a singular will-strengthening force and the unchangeable nature of addiction are no doubt present in some circles in Uganda, they are, as a pair, only one small part of the way that addictions and higher powers, plural, are imagined and engaged. This is particularly true of the Pentecostals and Basamize that I'm going to talk about this morning. Ugandan Pentecostals and Basamize attempting to overcome alcohol-related problems are less focused on asking God to help strengthen their wills than they are in using rituals to directly engage with the spiritual beings that they believe are impacting their lives. In short, it is less about making oneself strong enough to overcome a permanently determined state than it is about attempting to deal with the determining spiritual forces directly through ritual means. In the stories of the people involved in either spiritual warfare or kusamira, we find a model of personhood and agentive action in which people's actions are influenced by forces that are conceptualized as external and direct. In some cases, these influences are also thought to be changeable through prayer and other ritual work, and this opens up a range of possible futures that can sometimes be foreclosed in other models of addiction. To provide a sense of how these alternative modes of conceptualizing and engaging with addiction play out, I want to spend some time thinking about the stories of two of the people we've been spending time with over the course of the past year. And if you could see the image, and I don't know why the images aren't showing, you would see backs of people sitting in white chairs in a Pentecostal church. Daniela. Daniela is an impeccably dressed, well-educated young woman in her early 30s. You can often hear coming by the click of her high heels and the swish of her full skirts. Daniela also spends most of her time at Pastor John's church. Pastor John's is a large Christian fellowship in one of Kampala's many suburbs, hosting more than 18,000 congregants on a daily basis. While many of the people simply come for overnight prayers on Friday evenings or to listen to Pastor John's teachings during the day, Others stay for weeks or even years at a time, placing their suitcases and jerry cans for washing in stacks in the large gathering halls. Daniela herself spent over 2 years sleeping at Pastor John's after being referred to the church by a friend. When she first arrived, she had come to pray for a visa so that she could start her life over again in another country. At this time, Daniela was drinking very heavily. She had started drinking during her last year of secondary school. She started slowly, but by the time she reached university, she felt that there was little she could do without first taking a drink of the potent distilled spirit waraji. She would pack it to class, serve it to friends, study while drinking, discuss while drinking. She was drinking in taxis, at home, cooking, washing. She said that she was rarely without her bottle. Over time, this alcohol started to create problems for her, and she found she could not avoid drinking even when she knew she should. She missed job interviews or arrived drunk. Old friends were embarrassed to be seen with her. Her fiancé tried to help her stop, but he eventually left her too. When Daniela arrived at Pastor John's in 2014, she found that the teaching was very different from what she had expected, and she loved the ways that the pastors taught about forgiveness, anger, desperation, and frustration. Over time, Daniela came to think that even if she did go abroad, she would gain nothing, and so she decided for God to change her, thinking that only then would she get something in her life. She was still drinking at this time, but no one ever sent her away from church. She would come to church drunk to listen to the sermons and then go back home to her bottle. Over time, she settled there and began listening to the teaching with more seriousness. Eventually, in 2015, she decided to follow Pastor John's advice and approach the altar of grace and mercy with boldness, as she said, to tell God that she was tired of drinking. In prayer, she said, "You know what, God? I didn't want to become born again, but I came here. God, my life is a mess. I've lost everything because of alcohol. I've discovered that I can't leave it on my own. You say to me, 'Come to me, you who are weary, and I shall carry the burden for you. I don't want money. I don't want a husband. I want you to change me, to give me a new heart and put your spirit in me.'" She stayed in church and cried to God for 10 days, praying and fasting. On the 10th day of this fast, Pastor John was on the pulpit. It was around 2 a.m. Daniela had been crying and praying to God to change her, and Pastor John began to speak, addressing no one in particular. He said, "You girl, you who are here, you always feel that something is asking you for alcohol and you cannot contain it. You cannot contain it because it is not you. It is a spirit. Come up to the pulpit here and I will pray for you, for today is your day." Even that day, Daniela had been drinking alone at home before coming into the church, but she went up and Pastor John prayed for her. The church was full to capacity, but she was not afraid of anyone. Daniela says that as Pastor John prayed, she felt something heavy moving from her toes upward, and it went out of her. And that on this same day, God visited her in a dream. In the dream, God came in the form of Pastor John. In the dream, she was very dirty and tired, and Pastor John looked at her. He did not touch her, but he looked at her, and the more he looked at her, the more she became clean. Her clothes began to change too, and she saw herself in the dream transforming into a different person. When she woke up, she felt very happy, and she says that she had no desire to drink. And that was 3 years ago. 2 years after experiencing this deliverance, she started serving at church by voluntarily checking people's bags at the security desk, and this she did diligently for 2 months from Monday to Saturday. After these 2 months, she was given an opportunity to work on the church radio station. She did not have any training in radio presenting, but she was asked to present the early morning program. In 2018, Daniela met a man at a church-organized singles gathering, and the two married a few months later. Finally, we have images again. Sumuju. Sumuju began drinking when he was 15, taking a small bottle to be filled at an informal waraji distillery near his home, lying to the distillers, saying he had been sent by his father. His uncles advised his father to attend to the Lubale spirits that they believe lay behind his drinking. But at the urging of his stepmother, who Sumuju believes resented his possible spiritual gifts, his father refused to address the problem. Sumuju ultimately left home and went to live with a distant relative in Kampala. This relative, Jaja Kasumba, is the leader of a community of people who participate in the form of mediumship and worship known in Uganda as Kusamira. While Sumuju was glad to find a home away from his stepmother, he continued drinking, fighting in bars, and getting fired from every job he found. One day, while riding his bicycle, Sumuju got in an accident, and during the long period of convalescence that followed the accident, Samuju started questioning himself about his life and where his problems were coming from. He went to Jaja Kasumba to consult him, and Jaja Kasumba began to counsel him about his drinking and its possible spiritual causes. With the help of the Lubale spirits who possess him during divinations, Jaja Kasumba used Kauri divination to consult with Samuju's ancestral spirits to discover the source of the problem. The spirits explained that Samuju had two opposing Lubale in him, Chiwanaka and Bamoyana. Jaja Kasumba told Samuju that Chiwanaka was a very good and powerful spirit who did not drink, but that Chiwanaka had sent another spirit, Bamoyana, to make Samuju drink in ways that would ruin his life to punish him for his neglect of his spiritual duties. The spirit said that Samuju must satisfy both Bamoyana by making a proper offering of alcohol, and Chiwanaka by assembling a kit, including a long white tunic, a piece of bark cloth, a gourd, a stick, and a bag with money. Through these dual efforts, Samuju could effectively be relieved of Bamoyana's negative influences and come into a positive relationship with Chiwanaka. After a long delay and many other signs and dreams, Samuju eventually relented and followed these instructions that the spirits had given to him. He bought the necessary things at great expense and began to look for further instructions in dreams. Soon after assembling the kit, Samuju stopped drinking, and other things in his life began to change as well. Family members who he had lost touch with resurfaced in some truly miraculous ways, and he received an offer to work on a lucrative job in South Sudan, managing 2 trucks delivering agricultural supplies. Before leaving for South Sudan, Samuju left his Lubale kit with his best friend, instructing him to keep it well and agreeing to send him a little money each week in exchange for his help. Things were fine for a while, but one morning the friend who was keeping the kit took the long white tunic out of the bag and put it on. He also took the stick and used it to strike a sheep in Jaja Kasumba's compound. The sheep apparently died instantly. That night, Samuju was sleeping with other Ugandans in a tent in Juba when he suddenly woke up craving banana beer. Wondering if something had happened to his kit, Samuju called his wife in Kampala the next morning, told her to bathe with herbs and to check his kit to see if his friend had tampered with it. When she looked, she found that all of the money that had been stored in the bag was gone. Distraught and late to work, Samuju got dressed and went where the trucks were offloading the daily shipment from Kampala. As soon as he arrived, one of the truck owners told him that he didn't need him anymore, that he had gotten someone else. Then another called to give him the same news. Samuju was suddenly and inexplicably jobless. He called Jaja Kasumba for help. When he heard the story, Jaja Kasumba went and questioned the friend who had been keeping the kit. Upon finding that the friend had indeed tampered with the kit, Jaja Kasumba chased the friend from the compound. With no job, Samuju decided to return to Uganda, but before boarding the bus home, he used all of his remaining money to buy waraji, stuffing every pocket of his baggy trousers with plastic top packs. When he reached Kampala, he was drunk and nearly unconscious. In the week that followed, Samuju drank with abandon. Luckily, someone recognized him one night, passed out on the side of the road, and carried him back to Jaja Kasumba's compound. Eventually, Samuju was able to reassemble the kit, and once he did, he was able to stop drinking. This was 2012, and since that time, he has not had any serious problems with alcohol. He makes sure to keep the gourds he has left for Bamoyana filled with beer and regularly lights fires for Chiwanaka. He is also starting to take up the necessary training to become a leader of this community of Basamize himself. From time to time, he drinks a little beer or a little banana beer, but only during rituals and other offerings, and it doesn't cause him any problems now that he's settled his problems with Chiwanaka and Bamoyana. So for all of their differences, both Daniela and Samuju understood their problems with alcohol to be the result of the working of agents who were fundamentally other and external to themselves. As in Susan Reynolds White's work on the ways in which people confront misfortune in a neighboring area of eastern Uganda, the questions asked and the answers thought focus less on the introspective question, why me, than they do on the extrospective question, who are you, with the inquiring gaze focused on beings outside of the self. Further, as is also true in White's work, this question is not asked as a matter of abstract curiosity or even regret. Instead, it is a question asked in an effort to determine a course of action, in an effort to do something about the influence of those others who are impinging on one's life. For while life may be shaped by the actions of human and spiritual others, there are concrete things that can be done, either to exercise the spirit on one hand, or to repair and more productively attend to a relationship on the other. This way of understanding addiction differs substantially from the model put forward by Alcoholics Anonymous and the disease model of addiction more generally, specifically with regard to the question of permanence. In both the chronic relapsing brain disease model and the Alcoholics Anonymous model, addiction may be framed as something genetic or something acquired, or some combination of the two. But whatever it is seen as something permanent. Had Daniela or Samuju made their way to the alcohol and drug unit at the National Psychiatric Referral Hospital or to one of Kampala's newly founded AA groups, they would have been taught to see themselves as having a fundamental and unchanging condition. They would have likely learned to identify as addicts. They would have learned that they were a particular kind of person in Ian Hacking's sense. At Pastor John's, Daniela instead came to understand that her drinking was the result of the workings of a spirit who could only leave her through prayer, fasting, and commitment to Christ. In learning to see herself in this way, Daniela was coming to understand the influence of spiritual forces in the world that is sometimes known as spiritual warfare. The particular kind of spiritual warfare practiced at Pastor John's points towards a view of agency and moral culpability that sees behaviors such as problem drinking as being caused by the workings of demons that come from outside of the self. While a person's actions might unintentionally create openings for such non-human others to act in one's life or in the lives of other people tied or somehow related to that person, these non-human others can cause people to act in ways that quickly exceed their control and culpability. These demons are fundamentally non-self, and practitioners of this form of prayer believe that they can be defeated through ongoing prayer and intercession. At Jaja Kasumba's, Samuju came to understand his drinking as the effect of the actions of the Lubale spirit Chuanaka, who had sent the Lubale spirit Bamoyana to drink through him, sometimes described as drinking through you like a straw, to punish him for neglect. While Samuju was bound to Chuanaka through Chuanaka's intergenerational tie to his family, Samuju's drinking was fundamentally not his own. It was neither disease nor moral failing, but was rather a punishment inflicted upon him by a possessing spirit for his neglect of his spiritual duties. By properly attending to Chuanaka and Bamoyana, Samuju was freed from a form of drinking that had been inflicted upon him, while at the same time deepening his ties to Chuanaka and his hope of prospering through his care. Medical anthropologists have long held that symbols can be manipulated to produce transformative effects. In his classic 1963 essay, The Effectiveness of Symbols, the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss argued that the ritual use of language can both facilitate the expression of psychic states that are otherwise inexpressible and here's the important bit, change our relationship to those states and to the tasks at hand. Recounting the use of a therapeutic chant, which describes a dangerous quest through a pregnant woman's body that was deployed by the Cuna of Panama, Lévi-Strauss shows how the process of immersing the woman in the midst of a difficult birth in a vivid symbolic landscape could radically alter her relationship to the distress and exhaustion that may have been further slowing the birth. As the anthropologist Michael Jackson puts it in his discussion of this essay, the expressive value of the spell, which translates lived subjectivity into the objective language of myth, is linked to its instrumental purpose. For insofar as her experience of the situation is changed, the woman is better able to overcome the pain, distress, and exhaustion that may be contributing to the difficult birth. It is in this inductive property of symbols, says Lévi-Strauss, their power to induce or persuade us to think differently about our relationship to a task at hand or a situation in which we are experiencing great difficulty, that their effectiveness lies. And this process is, moreover, common to both shamanism and psychoanalysis. Further, as Jackson goes on to argue, here drawing on both Lévi-Strauss and Malinowski, ritual language has its effects not only in the fact that the words have been said or a story has been told, but rather that these words are inextricably linked to the warrant of tradition. The words uttered are not one's own, but are ancestral words, carrying the voice and presence of those in whom footsteps one walks. In this way, ritual speech becomes a form of action upon the world. For all of their disagreements, which are too numerous to detail here, anthropologists who have held as diverse viewpoints about the nature of social life and human being, as Malinowski, Lévi-Strauss, and Michael Jackson, have all agreed that material and non-material symbols can have effects on people's orientation towards their experiences and that these orientations have profound effects on these experiences and also on their actions in the world. In learning to see their illnesses as epiphanies, Sumuju and Daniela came to understand their situations and perhaps more importantly, their capacities for action in a new way. Whether or not sickness is seen as, and this is quoting de Hoysch, a demand that the links between men and spirits should be tightened, or as a sign that one must come to Jesus and be delivered from these same spirits, misfortune becomes the necessary and sufficient condition for the development of communication with the sacred. In coming to experience illness and misfortune in this way, Daniela and Sumuju's understandings of what they could do to respond to their addictions and what they could expect to result from these actions shifted. While such an interpretation might lead to deadly results in the case of an appendicitis if prayer and ritual are not also accompanied by surgery, I want to argue that in the case of addiction, such an understanding might open up radically new pathways for re-engaging with the future. As we can see in Sumuju and Daniela's stories, this process of repositioning oneself in relation to illness is not an easy one, and it can take months or even years to accomplish. But once embraced and symbolically engaged through ritual, speech, and action, these understandings of illness can have remarkable effects. Under the framework discussed above, we can see how Sumuju's ritual engagements with Chiwoneka and Bamoyana transformed his experiences of the world and allowed him to approach the task of sober living with a new kind of energy and commitment. Just as the woman Levi-Strauss described is reoriented in her struggle with an obstructed birth, so is Sumuju reoriented in his struggle with alcohol. Likewise, in understanding his relapse and the loss of his job as resulting from the destruction of the kit, the restoration of the kit becomes the means through which he can reorient himself towards sobriety once again. While the actions of a spirit like Chiwoneka or Bamoyana might seem to be entirely beyond our control, the possibilities of influencing these actions through the ritual restoration of the kit offer a mode of redress. There is now something to do that might have an effect, and in this, there is a new kind of hope, a new source of renewed strength. Further, and perhaps more importantly, where people live in communities that recognize both the not-me-ness of problem drinking and the efficacy of ritual action, these ways of understanding the self and its capacity for transformation may also create different possibilities for achievement of well-being through social connections. The fact that the people around Daniela at Pastor John's saw her as fundamentally separable from the spiritual forces that caused her to drink created important opportunities for building trusting interpersonal relationships. In short, the fact that her drinking was seen as having been caused by an agent that was both not her and separable from her afforded her a unique opportunity to begin again. This pattern is strikingly different from that found at Uganda's inpatient recovery centers, where didactic trainings and group therapy sessions often foster forms of suspicion that can make truly trusting relationships very difficult to achieve. While there are certainly tensions at Pastor John's and Jaja Kasumba's as well, seeing a person's past actions as authored by another seems to allow people to form different kinds of relationships in the present. Such relationships of trust are further fostered through the creation of a series of opportunities for demonstrating one's reliability and trustworthiness in progressively more public ways. We can think here of Daniela's work at the security desk and then later at the radio station. I want to close here by thinking a bit about the possible implications of this work for further research looking at the effects of engaging with spiritual forces experienced as not me in places in the United States where such ideas also have cultural salience. While the Chaganda spirit mediumship practices are not commonly found here, the ideas of deliverance and spiritual warfare being deployed by Ugandan Pentecostals and charismatics have emerged through dialogue with Christians in the United States. While spirituality and mindfulness have to some degree been embraced as potential resources for healing, the modes of agency, temporality, and spirituality embraced by people like Sumuju and Daniela and the practitioners of spiritual warfare in the United States might make scholars and practitioners a little more uncomfortable. But I want to argue that it's worth sitting with this discomfort long enough to learn what such models mean to those who hold them and what effects they have in their lives. And it is this, in fact, partly what I'm presently taking up with IASC postdoctoral fellow Josh Burraway in our study of opioid addiction and treatment in Southwest Virginia. Anthropologists like Angela Garcia have described the devastating stakes of of disease models that only seem to replicate the melancholic chronicity of endless loss in places where life has been shaped by acts of dispossession for generations. Through our work in Uganda, we hope to have found a way to build on her call to seriously consider potentials contained within other modes of living in relation to time by watching addictions and their afters unfold in a world that has not yet been completely colonized by the chronic disease model. Thank you.
People a moment to rotate. Thank you, China. That was such an interesting paper, and the form of it, and how distilled it was. And I have to say, it's one of the few hopeful papers I've heard in Anthropology in a while. So really appreciate that. So it was extremely resonant. So alcoholics seek cures from external spirit forces, and they sometimes find them, hopeful. Better track record than U.S. rehab. In the chronic brain disease model, we say to the alcoholic, this addiction is you, permanently wired into the synapses by past behaviors and whatever else. In the Ugandan spiritual warfare and Basamise models, we say to the alcoholic, this addiction is not you. And that poses a different forensics or etiology about this that leads to ways forward, concrete steps to take and relationships to forge with new people who can help with them. So there's so many interesting things that radiate out from that, and so many questions about, I know you're often get questions about the ontology of this that you're well prepared and maybe other people will want to raise, and about symbols as active forces, which are tremendously interesting to anthropologists. But I want to ask just two simple questions to get us started. And one is about the waiting period. Both stories involve a lengthy waiting period, years in which the drinker goes to a new place, meets new people, hangs around, and you're in the, sleeps in the church. This incredible church. Samuju, likewise, a long delay with many other signs and wonders. I imagine you've condensed a great deal into the paper that goes by very, very quickly. But I wanted to ask your thoughts on the length of the waiting period. Obviously, the waiting period involves a new community, new relationships, a key figure who mediates with the spirits. But since it's so prominent, and you came back to it at the end, it's just, what's your sense about that waiting period? Okay, the other question I wanted to ask is about the forensics, which is your central point. And it's so interesting to think about the place that blame gets seated in these stories. The U.S. model, the medicalized model supposedly neutralizes the blame, but still locates the addiction in me. It's now in my body, so deeply seated in my habits and wired into my synapses. What have I done to my synapses? These ideas posit a surrogate. So there's a scapegoat that takes the hit. There's a place to put the moral harm to the person's relationships. This made me think of restorative justice. And I'm going to just quickly give an example in Papua New Guinea, where I did field work. There's a lot of thinking and practice around harm. When I harm you, what happens if I do something terrible to your relative, your house, or your property? I pay compensation. And with Orokaiva people, I would procure a pig, raise a pig, give you a pig, give you taro with a whole group of people. And the thing that struck me about these compensation payments is that as soon as, so I've harmed, China, I'm going to use, I harm you, I hurt your hand, I insult you, I shame you, all these bad things. And then I pay you the pig to after a lengthy negotiation to compensate you, and you pay me back a pig and taro. So I've paid you a pig and taro, but you don't want to just receive it for the harm. You pay me back the same amount, so you keep your name high. And so one of the interesting things is it's sort of like I came out pretty well. as the right, as the culpable party. And the other thing that struck me in many examples of these is that people don't talk about fault once we pay the money. That I'm paying you the money because of the harm, and that's the extent of it. There's no forensics. There's no elaborate probing of why and who was to blame and all that, because people are really interested in using this exchange to move forward, and now we're establishing a cycle of positive relations, and that's the past and bad. And people naturalize this in the sense that really, really good friends aren't friends all the time. They go through cycles of bad relations and cycles of positive relations, and there are ways of transforming these back and forth. So everybody's frenemies. But I was thinking about the forensics again, that there's an exquisite balance of blame and not blame. And I thought that there's some of that here, that your central point is it's not you, as you say, or not me, but I'm not completely off the hook either. And that, just like in the restorative pig exchange, I don't have to sort of be plunged into the forensic acceptance of a fault. I'm now in the next step, but I still have skin in the game, literally, the pig. Here, there's also this, it's not no-fault healing, actually. It's a kind of exquisite balance of responsibility shedding through the scapegoat of the spirit or other external agent, and taking responsibility. And I was struck in Daniela, Daniela's story, she says, God, change me, I need a new heart. The heart is replaceable in this way of thinking about it. And anyway, I wanted to ask if you could comment on that kind of balance between skin in the game or needing to mobilize the relationships and the money for the kit and all that kind of thing, and the ability to externalize. And also, what's your thoughts on the sort of the optimal waiting period, or what is needed in the waiting period? And thank you again. That was just a great and thought-provoking paper.